60% of American gun deaths are suicides. We talk to our expert about how to address this epidemic that far too often goes ignored. Right now on CSGV at Home. Hello and welcome to CSGV at Home. My name is Andrew Patrick and I'm the Director of Political Communications for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. It is Wear Orange Weekend and where we are raising awareness about gun violence and gun violence prevention. And today we're talking about an area of the gun violence that is far too often left out of the conversation and ignored when talking about gun violence prevention, and that is gun suicides. So today we're speaking with one of our organizational experts on gun suicide, Director of Strategic Communications, Bryan Barks. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, a lot of people when talking about gun violence prevention leave out the fact that 60% of these gun deaths are gun suicides. What should more people know about firearm suicide and the ways that it could be prevented and be a bigger part in the gun violence prevention movement?
Yeah, so first, as you mentioned, I think it's really important for people to know how pervasive this problem really is. 3 out of 5 gun deaths are firearm suicides, and firearms are the most lethal and most commonly used suicide method in the United States. Guns are not the why. Suicide has a lot of root causes. A lot of them are social causes that underlie what goes on, but they are the how. And in a moment of crisis, guns make suicide far too quick and far too easy, and there's rarely a second chance. I think it's also important for people to recognize that suicide is preventable. There are steps we can take to prevent firearm suicide and suicide in general. And in the case of firearm suicide, many of those steps involve removing guns from an at-risk individual.
And Bryan, like you've written extensively for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence in a personal capacity about your own experiences with suicidality. During some of these periods, what was helpful for you? What was a good resource for you in suicide prevention?
I think the most helpful resource for me during periods of suicidality was lethal means safety counseling, which is something that we advocate for regularly. Lethal means safety counseling is working with a healthcare provider and working with the healthcare provider and their family to remove lethal means of suicide from a person's home during periods of high risk or crisis. And I don't keep a gun in my home because I am prone to periods of suicidality due to my bipolar disorder. I don't feel comfortable keeping a gun in my home for that reason. But for me, during periods of suicidality, removing other lethal methods of suicide from my home kept me feeling safe.
And lethal means counseling, certainly something that we've talked a lot about. What are some other resources that might be helpful in suicide prevention as we go forward in the gun violence prevention movement?
Well, extreme risk laws are one major policy that we have advocated for years. Extreme risk laws allow family members, law enforcement, in some cases other individuals, to temporarily petition a court to temporarily remove firearms from an individual who's at risk of harming themselves or others. That's one really important tool. Another tool that's not as well known is voluntary self-prohibition. It's only an option in a handful of states. But in that case, a person would be able to put themselves on a voluntary no-buy list to prevent themselves from buying a gun. And I've written about that policy, and if it were available in my state, I would put myself on a list to prevent myself from owning a gun. Because I know that in periods of crisis, that might be a decision that I would have trouble making in the moment. So those are 2 other policies in addition to lethal means safety counseling that we should really consider as strong suicide prevention policies.
Yeah, like especially like the voluntary prohibition to purchase firearms. I think it's based on like those who had gambling, the problems with gambling, and they were able to put themselves on a list to keep them from gambling. And it's something that a policy that we should definitely watch in state legislatures moving forward. So as we talk about gun suicides, it's still like the discussion at the federal and state level as gun violence prevention bills are introduced gun suicides are still left out a lot of these talks and a lot of the conversation. Why do you think that is, and what can we do to change it?
I think a lot of that has to do with the misconception that suicide isn't preventable and that firearm suicide isn't preventable and that there's nothing we can do. There's a misconception that people in suicidal crisis will find another way if they don't have a gun available. And in reality, evidence shows that the risk of method substitution is low in these cases. I think it's also important to note that the vast majority of people who attempt suicide and survive do not go on to die by suicide, which means that, and it shows us that if we can help people survive their crisis or help people survive their attempt, we are ultimately saving lives. People decide to stay if they survive their suicide attempt in the vast majority of cases. So I think just really hammering home that suicide is preventable. And there are things that we can do to stop these deaths.
Absolutely. Learning more about this, educating the public on it, what are where can people learn more about reducing gun suicides and making this a bigger part of gun violence prevention?
Well, we have a great resource at the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence called Prevent Firearm Suicide that discusses firearm suicide prevention. It talks about firearm suicide prevention at all levels. You can check it out at preventfirearmsuicide.com. You can also visit the EdFund website and visit our Learn page on firearm suicide. It has a lot of great information about this topic.
Absolutely. Bryan, I want to thank you so much for joining us, taking the time, talking about your experience and just sharing your expertise with everybody. So thank you so much and take care.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.